The following program is a presentation of Winchester Academy.
Thank you. Can everybody hear this? I mean, I know you can hear me because my voice is very loud, so all of my first grade teachers told me. So normally speaking up in a even modestly sized room is not usually a problem, but I guess we're recording, so you need to be able to hear me over this thing too. So today we're going to spend some time talking a little bit about cryptocurrency and sort of the infrastructure, the technology that underlies cryptocurrency called blockchain. And we're going to talk about it in maybe a slightly roundabout way. And the reason I say that is because I'm a technologist, right? Like I grew up, I met with the high school kids earlier today, and I was telling them that I wrote my first computer game when I was 8. And so I've been around computers a while, and I understand technology pretty well, but I get that not everybody does. I'm going to assume at least a few of you in the room are not technologists. So I don't like to start from a place of technology because, quite frankly, unless you're a technologist, like the technology piece of it is pretty boring, and this is already going to be boring enough, so I don't need to bore you even more with how the technology works. We'll talk about how blockchain works. I promise you we'll get there, but it's not going to be a super technical conversation because I don't think that's really what's interesting about cryptocurrency, to be honest. You guys aren't here because you care about the difference between proof of stake and proof of work, which are things to worry about here, but not something we're going to get into today. Right? You're here because you've heard of cryptocurrency. You've probably heard of people being scammed by cryptocurrency. You have probably been hearing about sort of this digital currency thing for the last few years, and you're kind of wondering what your grandchildren are going on about. And you've probably also seen some things that are going on in the greater world that you may not have fully realized were directly related. But I think that's really the way more interesting piece, right? These things that are going on in the world that turn out to be things that we've seen before, and we might even potentially have some solutions. So today we're going to talk about the U.S. money system, global money system, not just the U.S. money system, the global money system, right? Because financial systems have not been domestic for a long, in any of our lifetimes, right? Money supply has always been a global issue, right? How much a dollar is worth and the validity of said dollar is not something, it is something we take for granted today, is not something we've really had any serious doubt about for a long time, because the US dollar is the king currency, right, around the world. My wife and I, her sister lives in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And a few years ago, we went and visited, which was a wonderful trip. Highly, highly recommend that you visit Cambodia and go to Angkor Wat and the temples that are in the north. And the great thing about Cambodia that I didn't fully appreciate when we went is that it's a dual currency system. Okay? So it has its own Cambodian currency, which nobody uses. Even the Cambodians don't use it. Right? they always want American dollars because it's a dual currency. And the other currency that they use in Cambodia is the American dollar, right? And why do they use the American dollar as the currency there instead of the Cambodian dollar? Because even Cambodian people trust the American government more than they trust their own, right? And we laugh, but it's sadly true, right? The Cambodian government is going through huge upheaval right now. They have this guy that was purportedly elected, but runs the country like his own fiefdom. He's sort of related to kings that have been there in the past. And basically what we have now is this weird kind of quasi-elected monarchy that won't let dissenters speak up. I'm not here to rail about Cambodia. I'm just sort of pointing out that Cambodia has its own dollar, right? Cambodian real, I think is what they're called. But nobody uses it because nobody trusts the government, right? And the whole point of a dollar is that when I use that dollar to pay for goods and services, that dollar is worth what I'm paying, right? That's what a dollar is, right? That's what money is. It's a means of exchange for goods and services, right? Back in the day, again, before any of us existed, right? If I wanted to get paid for my legal services, right, and somebody in the community needed a contract written, say for the sale of 8 cows, I would say, sure, I'll write that contract for you if you give me one of the cows, right? But today I can't do that because my wife would kill me if I provided legal services in exchange for cows. But also because we have a medium of exchange so that, look, I live in a suburb in Madison. I don't need a cow, right? I wouldn't even know what to do with it if I had it. I would rather just use a dollar and go buy milk, right? So we have dollars because it's a more convenient means of exchange than barter, right? But the whole thing that makes that work is the fact that I trust the U.S. government, that when somebody gives me a dollar, that I can turn around and use it for something, right? And that the government isn't just because it happened to run out of dollars going to print a whole bunch more, right? Or that our king president isn't just going to wrap up the democracy and not allow anybody to run again. Yes, I'm talking about Cambodia right now. Sorry. I wasn't sure how well that joke was going to play here, I'll be honest. The point is that I need to be able to trust, right, the issuing entity. I need to be able to trust the government that dollar is going to continue to exist, right? Otherwise, we can get to sort of more concrete examples from all of our own lifetimes, right? We can think about the huge inflation, I mean, even beyond what we have today of South America in the 1970s, right? We all remember, right, super long lines for oil. We remember the entire nations almost going bankrupt because of hyperinflation, thinking South American countries like Argentina, Peru in the 70s, right? And these are all because people had lost faith in the issuing institution. Right? We haven't had that problem in the U.S. because we've been a relatively stable democracy for our 250 years of existence. Right? So on the one hand, our money, the money that we use to transact and exchange goods and services around the world, right? The dollar, which happens to coincidentally be the dollar, right? There's no reason why it has to be the dollar, right? It could be a British pound, right? Which in an earlier day, in another era, it might well have been, right? But it could be, there's no reason why it has to be the US dollar. It just is because the US happens to be the most stable country right now. That's not always true. It hasn't always been true, and it won't always be true. but the theory underlying it is trust. Same thing with our banking systems, right? I mean, a dollar is only so good as if I have a place to store that dollar. So most of the time, for most of the dollars that I get, much like I'm assuming a lot of you, you take your excess dollars and you give them to the neighborly community banker, right? You take your dollars and you say, banker, would you hold on to these for me? Right? And then the banker says, yes, I will be happy to hold on to these for you. And he takes your dollar bill and he walks down the hall until you can't see him anymore, and then he turns around and invests it, because that's what banks do. Right? Your dollar, the dollar that I handed you, or let's just keep our, you will learn here, I'm really bad at like metaphors, and I will mix metaphors all night, so hopefully you can keep up, because I guarantee you it makes sense in my head. Where was I? Banking. You were giving me dollars because I was starting this hypothetical that I had already gotten backwards by the time I started it. So you're going to give me dollars for the production, for legal services that I'm going to render, right? And I'm going to take that dollar. Let's pretend you give it to me in cash, because we'll very quickly get to not cash. But let's pretend you give me dollar bills in cash, and I go down to the banker. And I hand the banker the bills, and I say, I don't really have a need for these right now, but come the beginning of the month, I will need to write a check to my bank because they hold the mortgage and own my house, and I have to pay them for it. Right? But I don't have a use for those dollars today, but I might have a use for them later, so could you please hold on to them for me? Right? Now, no bank actually takes that dollar and puts it into a vault. I can't turn around and go ask for that exact same $20 bill back. Why? Because the bank doesn't keep that $20 bill, right? As soon as I'm out the door, and probably before I even walked in the door, the bank has spent my money, right? The bank turns around, and the bank uses my money to make more money. That's how banks work, right? They're going to take the money I have that I have given them. Now, interestingly, the way they phrase this, when I deposit money with my bank, I loan them the money. Right? That's how they think of my money, which should tell you everything you need to know about what banks think about my money. Right? So I'm going to hand them the dollar, or hand them $20, and they're going to turn around and lend 15 of it, because the U.S. government says you have to hold at least a quarter. You have to hold at least some amount of it, right? You can't just turn around and invest all of it. You have to be responsible, at least hold on to a dime, right? So roughly 10 to 20 cents out of every dollar, the bank's required to hold on to, right? These are our bank holding requirements that the Federal Deposit Insurance Company says the banks have to hold, that they're not allowed to turn around and use. Now, when I say not allowed, what you all should hear is, yeah, I pinky promise that I'm not going to do that, right? Because what we know is that the banks regularly violate those rules, and they lend out way more than their deposit limits say they should. Right? So they play around at the margins, even with the clear rules that we give them. They willingly break the rules. Then they turn around and use the dollars for risky investments. Right? A bank might turn around and say, boy, there's a fancy new technology. Everybody in the world seems to be getting in on that technology train. Let me get in on that technology train too. I have money burning a hole in my pocket. Let me invest in that. So the bank invests in the thing, thinking they're going to make their money back. And part of that investment, maybe, right, is that they're providing a loan so that they can build out infrastructure for their business, right? That's where the money, that's what the bank is using this money for. And so other people in the technology, here are the banks giving out money for building out infrastructure. So they go to the bank to get a bunch of loans, right? And then the bank says, well, wait a minute, we've just given out a bunch of loans. Maybe we need to take on some debt to make sure we have cash. Maybe we should go invest in some bonds. Maybe we should go make some other investments too to sort of diversify our holdings. And then the next thing you know, wouldn't you know it, inflation's out of hand. The investments that they made are going bad because inflation has driven up the cost of the people they invested in, driven up the cost of their money. And the next thing you know, that entire industry is going bankrupt, meaning the banks aren't going to get paid their money back, which means they're going to lose all the money they just invested in all of those businesses, which means consumers are going to come get their money because they're not sure the bank's even going to be around. Right? This is how bank runs happen. In fact, this is exactly how the first bank run of 1873, the 1873 panic, for those of you who remember it. And the technology there was railroads, right? Fast expanding all across the United States, fast expanding across England, fast expanding across Europe. Banks were willing to give out tons of money to railroads. And then it turns out inflation hit, messed with the bond markets, and the largest bank in the United States folded. This was in 1873, not 2023. So what we see is we have a money supply that is contingent on trust. Right? We have to trust the country that issues it. We have to trust every country that uses it and every person that uses it. And on the other side of it, the banks are just as bad. We have to trust them too. Right? We have to trust that they're going to be reasonable with our money. Right? We have to trust them to mediate disputes. Right? Using a modern example, right, of paying my mortgage. Well, if I'm going to pay that mortgage, I'm going to write a check, right? But what is a check but a promise to pay? So when I use a check, our banks have to negotiate with each other, right? When I write a check to my mortgage company, my bank and the mortgage company's bank negotiates with each other. The bank, the company that holds my mortgage says, hey, I got this check from a guy named Jeff. You know that guy? And my bank says, yeah, I know that guy. And they say, well, I'm holding a check. That guy just wrote me a check for however much my mortgage is. Does he have that much? My bank goes, let me check the accounts. Looks like it, provided he hasn't written a check to anybody else that would say otherwise. Sure, he has the money. And then my bank sends the other bank the money, right? And then I've paid my bill. Unless I didn't actually have money in my account, and then my bank contacts the other bank and says, oops, sorry, we screwed up. We shouldn't have given you that money. Please give it back. Right? This is how the banking system works. Believe it or not, this is exactly how the banking system works. Right? And back in the olden days, it was literally people calling each other up. And now we have sort of digital, we have computers that sort of do that negotiation for us, but it's a system that was set up by the banker, so it still mostly mimics this old-fashioned call somebody up, ask them for permission, right? But there's always this caveat of, well, what if the dollar is already spent, right? Even the banking system has to trust itself in order to work properly. So I'm going to quote now. Well, I'll tell you where I'm quoting from in a second. It says, while the system works well enough for most transactions, meaning the banking system, while the banking system works well enough for most transactions, it still suffers from the inherent weaknesses of the trust-based model. completely non-reversible transactions are not really possible, since financial institutions cannot avoid mediating disputes. Right? In other words, because the banking system is set up so that Bank One has to mediate the dispute, how much is in Jeff's account, since that's set up the way that it is, we all have to trust that the banking system is going to work, and we can't have a non-reversible system because of it. In other words, I as a bank cannot guarantee you the next bank that Jeff actually has that much money in his account. I need to be able to reverse that transaction just in case Jeff was stupid and made a transaction he didn't actually tell me about. Right? Everyone following? I know that was kind of confusing, but the whole system is predicated on this idea that we have to trust the bank, and we can't have transactions that aren't reversible because the whole system is set up to presume reversibility of the transaction. The cost of mediation increases transaction costs, limiting the minimum practical transaction size and cutting off the possibility for small casual transactions, and there is a broader cost in the loss of ability to make non-reversible payments for non-reversible services. Right? In other words, because of this fact that the banks have to mediate each other, it means necessarily that there is a transaction cost. And because there is a transaction cost, it limits the amount that I can do in a transaction, right? It wouldn't make any sense for me to send 50 cents via the bank because it costs the bank more than 50 cents to negotiate it. And I can prove this because every place that you go in the last 2 years is now charging you credit card fees, right? Because it costs money to negotiate that transaction. And they're not going to be the ones left holding the bag, right? You're going to pay for the transaction cost. So you pay the transaction cost by paying for the credit card fee. You pay the transaction cost when you pay MoneyGram to send money to Mexico, or when you pay your bank fees to manage your account. While with the possibility of reversal, the need for trust spreads. In other words, by having a reversible system, it requires a system that requires trust. Merchants must be wary of their customers, hassling them for more information than they would otherwise need. A certain percentage of fraud is accepted as unavoidable. These costs and payment uncertainties can be avoided in person by using physical currency, but no mechanism exists to make payments over a communications channel without a trusted party. So this is the white paper for Bitcoin. This is the very fundamental thesis of why Bitcoin exists. Right? It recognizes that there is this tension, and an inherent tension at that, between trust and usability. The higher the trust, the higher the transaction cost, the lower the usability, right? People who can't afford to use the network can't afford to use the network, right? So if you want to send money to somebody, but you can't afford to send money to somebody, you can't use the banking system. If you can't risk your money in a bank because they might lose it making risky bets on those railroad tycoons, if you can't afford to put your money in a bank, you can't afford the banking system, which means you can't afford to have money, which is kind of weird. But what if, on the other hand, we had a money system that was non-reversible and was inherently, by its own operation, trustworthy, right? We could know that the person entering into the transaction has the authority and the money to enter into the transaction, right? That's all we ever care about. When I sell services to somebody, right? I care that they have the authority to hire me and that they actually have the money they say they're going to. Right? That's what I care about. But right now I need to trust the United States government, and I need to trust any/all of the banks involved. Or we could have a technological solution. The Bitcoin paper was written, sorry, I'm trying to keep track of time here. Where am I at? 7 o'clock. All right, we're good. The Bitcoin white paper was written in October of 2008. And in that white paper, which I read the intro to, it calls for a decentralized, open source, peer-to-peer system of transfer that is cryptographically secure. We'll talk about what each of those things mean in a minute. Decentralized, open source, peer-to-peer system of transfer that is cryptographically secure. The first Bitcoin was mined a couple months later in January 2009. And the first real transaction to take place on the Bitcoin network was two $25 pizzas in exchange for 10,000 Bitcoin. Now I'm going to ruin some of the surprise on that. This person, in the first Bitcoin transaction, the first Bitcoin transaction to ever take place, paid 10,000 Bitcoin for two pizzas. Those pizzas in American dollars were worth $25. Today, one Bitcoin is worth $28,000. And they paid 10,000 Bitcoins for two pizzas. Very expensive pizza in retrospect. But, you know, that's what a market will do for you. So what do all those fancy words mean, right? So we have decentralized peer-to-peer system of transfer that is cryptographically secure and open source. Let's start with the last one first because it's kind of the easiest of them. What do we mean by open source? By open source, we mean that all of the code, all of the software that underlies the Bitcoin platform, that underlies the Bitcoin infrastructure, you all can go look at it on the internet right now. You can take it, you can use it, you can do whatever you like with it. It's what we call open source. It's there for everybody to see. So you want to know how Bitcoin works? Go read its source code. That's literally exactly how it works, right? Software only does what we, the humans, tell it to do, our AI overlords notwithstanding. But software only does what we tell it to, right? So if you want to know how Bitcoin works, you can go read the source code for it. You cannot go read the source code for JP Morgan. But you can go read the source code for Bitcoin so that you know how it works. You can trust that it works because you can look at the source code. And if it doesn't work like you think it's supposed to, well, it's right there for everybody to read. So open source is characteristic number one of a higher trust system. Right? Tells everybody how it works. It's decentralized or peer-to-peer. And what we mean by that is the computer that runs the software that is Bitcoin. The computer that runs that software isn't just one computer. It's many, many, many computers, thousands, millions of computers all over the world that are each running an instance of the Bitcoin software. And so because all of them are running it, no one person can shut it down, right? Some janitor at JP Morgan can't just walk into the server room and turn off the servers. That doesn't exist. It's not possible. There are literally millions of servers all over the world that are all running it. You can't just shut it down if it's politically inconvenient for it to exist, as has been the case with some currencies over the history of nation states. Right? You can't shut it down because it's inconvenient for it to exist. So what are all those computers actually doing? What are they running? What does that mean that the system for running Bitcoin is decentralized? So it's not like going to a website. It's not like that, right? Trying to think what it's more like, but basically each computer that's running does two things. One, it creates the network for all of the computers that have Bitcoin on them. We'll talk about what that means here in a second. But it runs as the network. So if I want to send any one of you in this room a Bitcoin, it's the network that holds a Bitcoin. It sounds a little bit circular, and in some ways, in a lot of ways, in all ways, it is circular. But it's basically a bunch of computers that exist for the purpose of existing for a Bitcoin. And what all those computers are doing is, A, it provides a network so that if one of you has an account and I have an account, I can log into my Bitcoin number, because we are all uniquely identifiable as a number on the Bitcoin network. Right? So I can log into my Bitcoin network and I can say, one of you has my Bitcoin now, or some fraction of my Bitcoin. But what the network really does is really what's behind that system. So what is the Bitcoin network? The Bitcoin network is a blockchain application. So to understand what that means, we have to understand what a blockchain is. But just understand that cryptocurrency is one type of blockchain application. So how does the blockchain work? It works like this. It's basically a ledger. Right? If I have a piece of paper, in fact, I have a piece of paper. I will show you my blank piece of paper. Blank piece of paper. Looks like a blank piece of paper, right? Yellow legal pad. We all have seen one before. Over here, we're going to put a date and time stamp. Each row is going to be a separate transaction, right? You've all recorded transactions on a piece of paper before, right? You write the date and time the transaction happened, who did it, to whom, and for how much. And then you move down to the next line. Next in line, somebody else sent X, A sent B, Y Bitcoins. That's it. That's all it is. That's all it logs. Who sent what to whom, period. End of story. That's it. You can go look at any Bitcoin ledger. It looks exactly like that. It is a horrendously boring list of transactions. Right? Person A sent to B 1.86 Bitcoin, which would be something like $50,000. One Bitcoin is 28,000. So one Bitcoin is $28,000. So each line is a separate transaction. When I get to the bottom of the page, and this is where the security comes in. Once a transaction goes onto this piece of paper, it's not allowed to come off. That's one of the rules of Bitcoin. It's one of the rules of blockchain. It's called immutability. Once a transaction goes onto this piece of paper, it cannot be removed. Remember the problem of the non-reversible transactions, right? All of our transactions are non-reversible transactions. Once it goes down, you can't get it back. Right? That transaction doesn't get deleted. Right? Which means once your Bitcoin is gone, it's gone. Once your fraction of a Bitcoin is gone, it's gone, because each one gets done in chronological order. Right? Each transaction is chronological order. So I can't have a double entry. There is no bank to fool. Right? I cannot kite a Bitcoin check. You guys all know what check kiting is. This room is old enough to know what check kiting is. Right? Check kiting, writing bad checks. Right? It's the legal phrase for writing bad checks. One of the first stories I learned about my dad when I was young is that he got arrested for kiting checks, which I don't think anybody would even arrest you for kiting checks unless they were big enough these days. But they used to do it for like $20 checks back in the day. So you can't, there's no such thing as kiting a check or floating a check as others might, right? You can't like post-date a check in the Bitcoin world because the transaction happens when it happens. Right? So as soon as it happens, money's gone. You can't send it to somebody else. That coin is already spoken for. So we write each of these things down on a separate line. And when we get to the end of the page, we're going to put a really big fancy number at the end of the page. It's an absolutely unique number that nobody knows except the system. And it's a number that has never existed before. And we're going to, when we get to the bottom of our ledger, we're going to put that number, and then we're going to start a new ledger. And at the top of the new ledger, we're going to write the same number we put at the bottom of the last one. That way we know everything on that ledger came after the one that came before it. Right? We can use that number, we can use sort of that cascading chain of numbers to know that this ledger came before that ledger, came before that ledger. Nobody's allowed to change them, so we know that none of those transactions got reversed. Right? We have created a blockchain. Right? We have taken our blocks, our ledgers, and we have chained them together with these cryptographically secure numbers. And that's what the Bitcoin computers are doing. They are calculating cryptographically secure numbers. That's it. That's all those computers do. That's it. It takes a long, long time to do it. And once you create one of those numbers, once you create a cryptographically secure number, the system says, thank you. Here's 1 Bitcoin for your effort. That's all it does. That's how Bitcoins get created. Bitcoins get created because somebody invented a really big number using a computer to do complicated math. That's how 1 Bitcoin gets created. Do that enough, and you have a money supply. Make it popular enough, and people will pay more than $1 for that 1 Bitcoin. People will pay $28,000 for 1 Bitcoin, apparently. But that's how the system works. So that was the genius of Satoshi Nakamoto, who's the person that wrote the Bitcoin white paper. Now, the interesting thing to know about Satoshi Nakamoto is he doesn't exist. It's a pseudonym. Nobody knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is. It was just the name he wrote the paper under. Nobody actually knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is. This guy, everybody knows who this guy is. Well, not you guys probably don't know who this guy is, but people in the crypto universe know who this guy is. Vitalik Buterin saw Bitcoin in action and said, I see your Bitcoin and I can do you one better. So Vitalik was born in Russia, moved to Canada when he was very young, and when he was in college, he worked on a program. His college research was on a program called the Tor Project. The Tor Project, Tor, T-O-R, stands for the onion routing. The onion routing project. And what was the onion routing project? The onion routing project is an interesting project in its own right But the purpose of the onion routing project was this recognition that the internet is not an anonymous place. If I want to figure out who you are on the internet, it's pretty easy to do that. Because we all have, whenever you get onto the internet, you have a unique number that gets assigned to you. Well, and it turns out that unique number isn't that unique. And I can trace with some amount of accuracy what ISP, what service provider gave you that number, where roughly in the country you live because of that number. And then when I know the actual details of that number, I can figure out which computer in your house that you use. Right? This is your IP address. This is your IP address, your internet protocol address. Everybody has one. And it turns out that there are people who use the internet that don't want you to know they're using the internet. And that might be for any number of reasons, right? We can all think of the malicious reasons why people wouldn't want you to know you're using the internet, right? Because you want to buy drugs is maybe a good reason to use the internet. You don't want people to know, right? But maybe also you're a victim of sexual violence. You're escaping a repressive regime. You're leading the overthrow of a repressive regime. Right? There are lots of good reasons to want to be anonymous on the internet, too. And it turns out that the way that the internet is written makes that very, very, very difficult because you are, by definition, or by default, I should say, not anonymous on the internet, even though we might think we are. We can be tracked pretty easily. So the onion routing project still exists to this day, by the way. The Tor network and the Tor protocol, really foundational research in the privacy part of government, or the privacy part of the internet. So Vitalik, our hero Vitalik here, worked on the Tor project when he was in undergrad. While he was writing about that, he started thinking about blockchain, started thinking about Bitcoin. And in 2013, 3 years after the first transaction on Bitcoin, 5 years after the white paper for Bitcoin, Vitalik writes his own white paper describing a coin called Ethereum. Now, this is a variant of Bitcoin. It is based at its root on the Bitcoin open source code because it is open source, so you can go out, hey, look, free blockchain code, neat. But what Vitalik brought to it was viewing the ledger as something different than merely a financial ledger. Right? It didn't have to be. Turns out that it doesn't have to just record transactions. Turns out, instead of putting a $sign into the transaction, right? Remember, we were saying that basically what Bitcoin looks like is A to B 1.8 Bitcoin. Well, what if instead of 1.8 Bitcoin, what if I put computer code there? Right? So it says A to B computer code and just sits out there on the blockchain. And I write the computer code in a way such that it just sits there using the processing power of all those millions of computers to just wait for somebody to interact with it and do what it was written to do. So one thing that we could have our blockchain-based piece of code do is what we'll call parametric insurance. Right? Everybody here has purchased insurance at some point in their life, I'm assuming. Anybody ever had to submit a claim for hail damage? A few of you, right? So how does a claim for hail damage work? It works like this. You have your house coverage, and you have your home coverage, and a hailstorm happens. That's usually part of making a hail claim is first there's a hailstorm. And so the hailstorm happens and it hits your roof, tears up some of the shingles, and the next morning you call your insurance company. Hi, insurance company, I had a hailstorm last night. And the insurance agent goes, oh yeah, I heard about that. Man, must have been really bad, huh? Like, yeah, took some shingles off my roof. I'd like to make a claim. And they take your claim. And then they deny it because that's what insurance companies do. But then what they do is they come visit your house, right? Insurance agent comes out, looks up at your roof and goes, man, that looks pretty bad. Doesn't look like hail damage, though. What about raccoons? Think raccoons might have done that? Right? They start making a bunch of excuses about why it's not something that's covered by your insurance. Right? And then you start fighting with them. Right? Was it covered by insurance? Was it not covered by insurance? Was this caused by hail? And they go watch the news or they talk to the weather person and they say, hey, did it hail where Jeff lives last night? And they go, yeah, Madison had really bad hail. And they go, no, not did Madison have bad hail. Did it hail on Jeff's house? That's what I'm concerned about. Because Jeff's the one making a claim, and just because it hailed in Sun Prairie doesn't mean it hailed at Jeff's house. We have a few minutes, but I'll tell you a really quick. I think it's a funny story. My wife, not so much. Middle of the night, our phone alarms start going off because there was some sort of tornado warning. Well, I heard it. My wife didn't. I looked at it. It goes, tornado in Dane County. So I was like, all right, Dane County's a big place. Put the phone back on my bedstand, went to sleep. Wake up in the morning, 2 neighborhoods away, completely destroyed by tornado. And my wife says, gee, Jeff, there's a really bad storm last night. Did you hear that? Yeah. Did you know there was a bunch of houses destroyed a couple blocks away? Yeah, gee, heard about that. That was rough. Yeah, too bad we didn't hear anything about that tornado and could have gone downstairs. It's like, funny thing about that. We did, but I didn't think about it, right? Because Dane County's a big place, right? So insurance company wants to know that it hailed on Jeff's house, not just that it hailed in Dane County. So the weather guy goes, maybe we think it hailed at Jeff's house. Like we have a weather station that's, a 1.5 miles away. That's kind of close. So yeah, we think it hailed at Jeff's house. And the insurance company, if I'm lucky, pays it out. Or what if we could do this? What if Jeff could pay for house insurance, and then upon getting said insurance from my insurance company, instead, they hand me a little weather station. They say, Jeff, put this weather station at your house. Because what's going to happen is your insurance contract is now just sitting there waiting for an event to happen. Just sitting on the blockchain waiting for an event to happen. And it's going to listen to the weather station. And as soon as that weather station triggers enough hail, we're going to pay you out for hail damage because we know with that much hail that you had to have had damage. Don't even need to submit a claim, we'll just pay it out. That's what the blockchain enables. That's what Vitalik invented. Being able to just put that code out so that when what we call oracle, my weather station being an oracle, when that oracle checks in, it can just hit that code sitting on the internet, sitting in the blockchain, and it knows who I am because that code is registered to me because it's the blockchain, immutable, irreversible, right? So it knows I'm associated with that. It knows it hailed, so it just pays me out. Call that parametric insurance, and it's one of the things that's possible because of Ethereum. This gentleman, SBF to his friends, you can call him Sam. Sam Bankman-Fried was the CEO of FTX and the CEO of Alameda Research. Those things don't really mean anything to you right now. But Mr. Bankman-Fried graduated from MIT in 2014. He worked as a stock trader for Jane Street Capital, which is a very fancy Manhattan stock trading company. His mother and father are both professors at Stanford Law, and I don't hold that against him, but his parents are both professors at Stanford Law. And in 2017, he starts Alameda Research Company. Alameda Research is a lot like his stock trading firm, but instead of trading stock, they trade cryptocurrencies. At its height, Alameda was a pretty normal trading company. It was trading $1 to $10 billion in cryptocurrencies every day. Its trading volume was $1 billion to $10 billion in cryptocurrencies every day. FTX, at its height, was the fourth largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world. Now, what is an exchange, right? We heard about the cryptocurrency platform, right? We heard about Bitcoin, right? And that is the platform. That is the coin network. But it's kind of hard for me to just go buy a Bitcoin off the network. It's not impossible. I can accomplish the feat. But it's relatively complicated. We can make it considerably easier if we put an intermediary in the middle of me and the Bitcoin network, and we think of it like an exchange, right? Like a stock exchange, right? If I want to buy Apple stock, right, I don't go ask Tim Cook if I can buy some Apple stock from him, right? I go to the New York Stock Exchange and I buy Apple stock from the New York Stock Exchange. Right? Or I have my trading company buy it from the New York Stock Exchange. Now, one thing that you might be thinking that might be sending off alarms in your head is that it would be unusual to go buy from the trading firm that also owns the exchange. Right? You might think, gee, that's probably not a right relationship between a firm and the exchange, right? There's probably a lot of shady things that can go on when one person owns both a $10 billion trading firm that trades in the exact same commodities that his exchange owns. And you would be right. You would be right. But let me get to some of the background on FTX. So in 3 years, he grew FTX to a $32 billion company. In 2021, he bought the naming rights to the arena where the Miami Heat play and was an official sponsor of Major League Baseball. Started a $2 billion venture capital fund that would invest in crypto-based entrepreneurs. And FTX started in Hong Kong, but was moved to the Bahamas because of a friendlier regulatory environment. Now, I will tell you, as a lawyer, I will give you some of the best advice you will ever hear. If somebody is forum shopping because they think they can get a friendlier regulatory environment, that means that's code for I want to go to jail. And in early 2014, the world's largest cryptocurrency exchange, organization called Mt. Gox, based in Tokyo, folded and filed bankruptcy in 2014 because $460 million worth of Bitcoin was stolen by hackers. And that was the second hack of Mt. Gox. The first was in 2011 when 8.75 million was stolen. An additional 27 million were embezzled from bank accounts. All of that money was money that was held by Mt. Gox on behalf of their customers. The guy named Mark Capellas, the king of Bitcoin, is currently sitting in jail. Flash forward, we now know, we knew then, but we know now, that the exchanges themselves are the weak points of this system. Whenever you hear of almost any crypto-based scheme or hack, it was through an exchange, right? Because that's where consumers meet the technology. Because the technology itself, the underlying technology, the Bitcoin network, the Ethereum network, those networks themselves have never been hacked. But the exchanges have been hacked a number of times, and that's what happened with Mt. Gox. So, but like the banking industry, Mr. Bankman-Fried was holding on to a bunch of his customer deposits, in this case in cryptocurrencies, while they were waiting for their transactions to settle. He thought, like most bankers, gee, I can use this money to make some money. So he took some of the money, some of his customer money, out of FTX, and said, Alameda Research, you're really good at trading. Why don't you trade some of this money and win us lots of loot? And they promptly lost a lot of it. And it turns out one of his competitors found out he was doing this. So the competitor, by the way, all of this, very, very illegal for exchanges to be doing this. So competitor rats him out on Twitter. I mean, this is what this stuff is made of, right? Like, they get ratted out on Twitter. And the next day, the regulators show up. Mr. Bankman-Fried runs off to the Bahamas to try to avoid extradition, realizes he's too famous to avoid extradition, comes back to the United States, where he gets arrested. In November of 2022, Sam Bankman-Fried was arrested in the Bahamas on 8 counts of criminal fraud related to FTX and Alameda Research. Alameda was trading FTX customer holdings and losing money. Their competitor, company named Binance, had ratted him out. In probably the least surprising turn of events, if you've been listening at all, turns out the competitor, Binance, was doing the exact same thing and is now under investigation by the Justice Department for money laundering and violating securities laws. And we're right back where we started with our bank that was overly invested in the hot new technology that gets sunk because a global financial crisis causes one of the largest banks in the country to fold overnight. I think I got us in an hour. That's it. Questions? Yeah, I think we have microphones for questions.
Okay, you started with is it on?
Yep.
With an example,
Yes.
with me making a transaction with somebody and then sending them something that we'll call Bitcoins.
Sure.
Where'd I get them?
Yeah, so all Bitcoin at one point was created through this process of mining, right? At some
You
point.
call it mining. I mean, they weren't digging it out of the earth.
They were not literally digging it out
No.
of the earth, no.
How do
The
you mine?
computer was doing fancy math. That's what we call mining. The computer was discovering new numbers by doing fancy math in a very specific way.
And they turned into bitcoins.
And in
those
exchange,
numbers.
as a reward for coming up with that big fancy number, the computer that came up with that big fancy number gets rewarded with 1 Bitcoin. How big is that number? Very large, 256 characters, at least. Well, if you tried to hack it, it would take you multiple lifetimes to accomplish that feat. And so at some point, one person owned each of those Bitcoins. So if I mined 2 numbers, I now own 2 Bitcoins. But if I mined 2 numbers and sold it to somebody and sold my 2 to somebody who also mined 2, they now have 4. And do that often enough, I now hold 0.
So somebody has turned up with all of these numbers, and they somehow become bitcoins, and somehow I get them into my hands so that I can give them to somebody else.
Yes.
But the process from beginning to that point completely eludes me.
Software magic.
Well,
So I have a computer program.
what gives it value?
What gives anything value? Right? If I were to sell you my car, how much is my car worth?
Well, so did I buy these numbers from somebody that turned into Bitcoin?
The person that created the number gets 1 Bitcoin in exchange. That's the reward. That's just, it's not inherently worth anything. I mean, what's a dollar inherently?
Well, let's
A
start-
dollar's not inherently worth anything. Right? I mean, it's a piece of paper that I trust is worth $20 because the US government tells me so. Right? Same thing with a Bitcoin. Bitcoin's not worth anything except what somebody's willing to pay me for it. And if somebody's willing to pay me $28,000, then 1 Bitcoin is worth $28,000.
And so I must have started with 28,000 of my own to buy the Bitcoins.
No, you can pay US dollars for a Bitcoin. That's what I use in exchange for.
Sir?
Yes, sir.
You started out talking about the U.S. banking system, and I think it's important for the community here to have comfort in our banking system.
Yeah, I don't know that I was terribly
You
comforting about
discussed-
the banking system.
Oh, I disagree. You discussed it with, you discussed a national bank, J.P. Morgan Chase. You ended up with a regional bank, Silicon Valley. We deal with local community banks, Farmer State, Community, Premier, whoever anybody here deals with. The difference is we are guaranteed by the federal government an insurance policy of our deposits up to $250,000. You then went in to discuss cryptocurrencies. Your first example was buying 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoins. Now you're saying 1 Bitcoin has a value of $28,000. Warren Buffett, who I think is one of the most respected investors, has described cryptocurrency as a Ponzi scheme. So I think it's important for the local people here to have faith in our community banks, our banking systems as a whole, because we're guaranteed by an insurance policy. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Yeah, no, excellent point. The FDIC and federal insurance certainly helps a lot to put trust into the system so that we know that when we're banked locally that we're going to get our deposits back.
I've been doing some reading where our infinite wisdom in Congress has passed a law which will allow the Fed to develop a cryptocurrency. Can you talk to that, please?
I can. Anybody can do whatever they like, right? Is sort of the short of it. Look, if the U.S. government if the U.S. government is going to back a digital coin, a digital currency, that's very different than the non-nation state-backed system that is Bitcoin. I would argue, and I think Satoshi Nakamoto, to the extent he exists at all, but I think the greater argument is that the whole point of the independent system is that it doesn't rely on the trust in the U.S. government. Because today we trust the U.S. government, but tomorrow we may not. Right? And that might sound heretical, that might sound unpatriotic. There are a whole lot of reasons why people lose faith in national systems. Right? You can look at Argentina, who went through things and got through it on the other side. You can look at countries that haven't. Right? There are a whole lot of ways in which countries can and do undermine their own authority. So not to say that a U.S.-backed digital currency wouldn't have wide success. I'm sure it would. I'm sure it'd be used way more than Bitcoin to purchase actual goods and services. But when you lose faith in the U.S. government to back that dollar, everything's on the same footing again.
Well, we have lost faith because all they have to do is print paper.
Different kind of faith, right? Understood. I mean, and you know, not to be flip, but I think that's in a lot of ways some of the point, right? Is that even when we look at stable countries and we look at modern fiscal policy, we still see a lot of things that are concerning, right? We still see systems that are held up merely by trust, because we trust that the people who are in those systems are going to do the right things and for the right reasons. But we've also seen that those systems don't always survive if there's somebody there that isn't trustworthy.
The key in a world economy is how does each government collect their taxes?
That is certainly a concern of a nation state. It may not be the concern of people who are just trying to trade goods for services.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Okay. It seems to me that there are some steps that we can go back to. Say we have no currency whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
How do I decide what something is worth? Because what struck me most of all is what made that thing worth 10,000 or whatever that was, and not 500 or 50 million or whatever. But the dollar to me, or whatever currency, is worth, because money to me is only an exchange between individuals' energies. It's my energy of working 4 hours a day doing something that I decide whether it's worth $4, $10, or $50. Okay? And in the barter system, which is what you would have when you don't have any other, then you decide, okay, I might want my house painted. Will you take 4 hours of my labor doing your yard if you do my roof for X number or whatever? So we exchange our individual energies. It is our individual energy that is the basis of all currency, as far as I'm concerned. And so are you saying that the Bitcoin is the value of this gentleman who invited this fancy number, and because of his energies, he's receiving 1 Bitcoin? Is that what I'm to gather from this? Or, you know, how do you determine in the first place the value of something? We used to have gold or diamonds or chips from whatever it is.
Yeah.
Okay? And so that's my basic thing, that not to forget that the piece of paper is my energy versus your energy.
I agree with that 100%. So I think, you know, whenever we're talking about, you know, when we think about sort of the concept of money and why we have global banking systems, I mean, your point is well taken, right? What is this all for? Why are we doing this, right? And we're doing this so that I, as a human being, can exchange goods and services, right? Because I need something that I would like to acquire, and somebody else has something that they would like to give me, right? And when we recognize each other's effort in that way, I think, I mean, that's the ideal, but it's just not, it only goes so far when I need to buy shampoo at Target, right? When I just need some cash and the cashier isn't going to trade me legal services for some shampoo, right? So at some point I need a means of exchange that isn't simply me, that it needs to be something more generalized than Jeff's legal services. So we need to have some form of money, some form of independent system of compensation. How we decide how much that's worth gets to the two, at its heart, gets to the two people exchanging it, right? I think it's worth X, you agree it's worth X, so we exchange X, right? There's nobody there sitting there saying, no, Jeff, that car was actually worth $30,000 and you only sold it for $25,000. It was worth $25,000 to me, it was worth $25,000 to you, so we sold it for $25,000, right? Similarly with Bitcoin, right? How is the value of Bitcoin determined? Same way the value of diamonds is determined. The same way the value of any other, same way the value of a stock is determined. We have limited supply and more people that want to buy it than the number of people who are available to sell it. So the price goes up. That's how, right? It's just when there are more people that want something than people who have to sell it, prices go up. Right? So when somebody says, no, I'm not going to pay that anymore, is where we cap the price. And that's how market systems work. We can have a whole other discussion about whether that kind of a market system is the right idea or not, but that's a very different but related discussion.
Is it possible for any group of people to invest in a server and start mining?
Yes, it is. Any one of you can go buy a computer. The computers that are best for mining blockchain are actually video graphics cards that like video game players buy. Turns out those are really good at doing these kinds of calculations. So there was actually a global shortage on video game graphics cards while everybody was investing in Bitcoin miners because they're all based on video graphics card drivers. They're all based on video graphics cards processors. But yes, you can. If you have a computer and you put the Bitcoin code on it, you can run it and it will eventually mine you a Bitcoin. Yeah, oh yeah. You can go download it at home tonight. You can probably have it up and running before you go to bed.
So
now it'll kill your utility bills because it's very energy demanding. And so there's actually a lot of places that are banning crypto mining because the processors, the computers, take so much energy that it taxes the local power systems. So I think we have time for like a question or two.
Does anybody have a final question? How about final closing remarks?
Closing remarks. I didn't know I was going to have to prepare closing remarks.
And I apologize for not preparing you for that.
No, it's not a problem. I mean, I guess what I would say is just this, right? That we need to look, much like what we were saying before, we need to look past the specific and see the problems that exist in the world and come up with new, interesting, innovative technological solutions that can have the effect of causing us to trust each other more, right? We can use technology to remove the intermediaries between us and just exchange directly. And technology gives us that ability to do it. Now, as with all technologies, there's always a figuring out period. We were joking before this started. I do a different version of this talk, and the guy last week, I think, talked about scams, right? And certainly there are crypto scams out there to be had. I would not encourage anyone to enter into any crypto transaction lightly. And there are certainly a lot of scams out there to be had. But I can also tell you that, that there were scams over radio when it was first invented. I was reading, we were talking about this beforehand, I was reading that when radio was first invented, there were people going around saying that if you hold the radio up to your head, it will cure cancer. The radio waves from the radio, if you just buy the right kind of radio from the right kind of person, this radio will cure cancer if you just hold it to your head. Right? Those were the scams of its day. Right? Because it was a new technology. Nobody knows how radio works. Mysterious, right? Now we all know that's ridiculous because it just takes time for people to get comfortable with technology, for technology to get comfortable with technology. Right? That all takes time. So don't be afraid of the technology, but look at the problems around you and see how can we solve those problems. And don't be afraid to say maybe new technology can be an answer. And that's kind of a weird summary, but that's the best I got.
Thank you very much.